The St. Salvador Day festival is brimming with people, all clad in red capes. Becca Crane rushes to save Edward Cullen, who is ready to strip off amidst the crowd, revealing his diamond-like luminous skin. The Zolturi, a powerful vampire coven, watches him and gets concerned, as he is going to expose himself in front of the humans, thus exposing the existence of vampires. Becca runs through the fountain. As she does, someone sees it, and mistakes it for a party in the fountain. All the women get in the little fountain pool. Becca cannot seem to get past them as they block her way. Infuriated, she starts tackling all the women one by one, showing power moves. She finally manages to get out, and shouts Edward's name. A crazy fan jumps in front of her and professes her love for Edward, only to be smacked on the face with a shovel by a die-hard Jacob fan. A fight breaks out between the Jacob fans and Edward fans. Edward is fully exposed now, and the Zolturi signal for Edward to be eliminated. Becca sees this and rushes to save him from the other members of Zolturi by performing an acrobatic stunt. She is caught off guard when the member of Zolturi jumps simultaneously, scaring her with his single fang. We are then taken to where it all started. Becca used to live with her mom in Nevada. Since she began dating Tiger Woods and was always on the road, Becca thought it would be better to move to the foggy town of Sporks, Washington, with her dad Frank, who is also the town sheriff. As they make their way through the town, she feels there is something strange about the town. Even after witnessing a vampire attacking a civilian, a vampire dentist sign, and a homeless vampire who will do anything for blood, Becca can't quite put her finger on it. And Frank is clueless, so much for being a sheriff. They reach home, and Frank shows Becca her room, saying he has kept it just as she left. The room still has a crib, a dollhouse, a miniature dining table, dolls, and her pet hamster, which is all bones now. Frank still thought of her as her little girl, but Becca had to remind him sternly she is a teenager now, after her dad shoved a pacifier in her mouth. But it didn't seem Frank got the clue, because he tucked Becca in a baby harness and brought her downstairs to meet Bobby and Jacob. Jacob and Becca catch up, and Frank and Bobby beat each other black and blue. This is their way of having fun. Jacob confides in Becca since puberty hit him. His body has been undergoing some changes. At her new school, Becca gets a welcome of her life. After making it inside the school building, she makes a new friend Derek, but not before being punched by him first. He is the eyes and ears of the school. Jennifer and Rick join the group too. While sitting in the cafeteria, she sees a group of kids walk in. Jennifer tells her they are the Cullens, all adopted by Dr. Carlton. She further explains they are very strange because their skin is ice cold, they feed on flesh, and they sleep in coffins. In biology class, Becca talks to Edward for the first time. He had to hold his breath because of the obnoxious smell that Becca revealed was from her tuna sandwich. To her surprise, they all had to study Vampire Diaries, which Edward explained was the trend of that era. The group of vampires has come and is eliminating people. But for some reason, they keep getting mistaken for black-eyed peas. Later, Becca is getting ready to leave when a van loses control, and she is about to get struck by it. But Edward stops it by thrusting Derek in the way. Becca and Edward stare at each other, while Derek screams in pain and curses teenage love. Once home, Becca cannot stop thinking about Edward. Jacob also rushes to see if she is doing fine. He hands her flowers and balloons, with confessions of love written all over them. But Becca acts clueless, and says he is like a little brother to her. Jacob warns Becca to stay away from Edward, and runs when Frank comes out of the house. Frank tells Becca that Fisherman Scully was eliminated. The blood was drained from his body, and he had multiple bite wounds all over his neck, which can mean only one thing: Kardashians are in town. He hands his daughter pepper spray to protect herself from the prospective killer. Later at night, Becca dreams that Edward is in her room, wearing a bathrobe, his hair tightly pinned in curlers, and using white strips to whiten his teeth. He asks her to go back to sleep, but Becca proceeds to destroy her room and fart on Edward's face, sending him crashing down the window. She wakes up from the sound of the crash, contemplating if Edward was really in her room. The business card he dropped in her room makes her even more intrigued to know who is Edward Cullen, or what is Edward Cullen. The next day at school, prom fever is high. Jennifer gets furious when Becca says prom is not her thing. But Becca is too obsessed with Edward to think of anything else. She finds him sitting alone and tells him they need to talk. They go into the nearby woods. After much contemplation and thought, Becca has finally figured out what Edward Cullen is. She confronts him for being one of Jonah's brothers. Edward corrects her that he is a vampire, and Becca is relieved, as this was going to be her second guess. Edward warns her he's dangerous, but when Becca doesn't back off, he tells her his family is different as they only feed on animals, and the Real Housewives of Atlanta. But somehow, he cannot seem to control himself when he is around Becca. He can read everybody's mind but hers. Becca confesses she likes Edward, and wants to be with him. Edward tells her to tell him exactly what she's thinking. Becca agrees and says he is pretty, so he doesn't have to be smart. Edward smiles and asks Becca if she'll go to prom with him. She says yes. Becca was sure of three things. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, American Idol was going to blow without Simon. And third, the next time she sees Edward, she is going to give in to her desires. Edward comes out of nowhere into her room. He says he wants to try something and leans in to kiss her. Edward chuckles like a little girl because he has never kissed a girl before, but Becca wants more. She pounces on him, but when she doesn't stop, Edward has to smash the vase on her head to make her stop. He explains that if they want to be together, they have to take things slow. Edward promises Becca she will never get hurt till he is with her. Suddenly the dish antenna from the roof falls on her head, along with concrete, bricks, sand, and other material. Edward waits till the rubble stops falling and renews his promise starting then. The three vampires are being chased by Frank, Jacob, and Bobby. They don't know who they are till Bobby points to the bigger picture and shows him a big picture of the three. It is Becca's 18th birthday. Sullins has organized a birthday party for her. Becca feels nervous, thinking if she will be accepted by his family. Edward takes her in, and everybody gathers to meet Becca. Eden, Edward's mom, greets her first. Alex and Rosalind are not very thrilled to meet her. However, Iris hugs her, saying they will be best friends. She has seen it in her visions. Edward explains that some of them have special powers, and Iris has a vision of the future. Jeremiah is new to the family and is still trying to control his hunger for humans. He sees Becca as a big cheeseburger and instantly feels hungry. While opening presents, Becca gets a paper cut that bleeds rather profoundly. Jeremiah rushes towards Becca with a fork and a knife, but Edward pushes him away. In the process, Becca gets more injuries, making all the vampires thirsty for her blood. Edward has had enough of them, and he starts whining that every time he brings his girlfriends, his family tries to eat them. But not this time. At that moment, a delivery boy comes with the food delivery, and Edward takes this opportunity to satiate his family's hunger by presenting them with the delivery guy. Everybody starts to feast on him, and Edward mounts Becca on his back and takes her away on his hoverboard. Once at a safe distance, Edward feels sad about what happened. He cannot let that happen again. Becca wants him to turn her into one of them, but Edward refuses. He says she will never see him again, and also makes her promise not to do anything reckless. Becca promises she won't date Chris Brown. He breaks up with her and leaves. Becca realizes she is all alone. So she runs, calling Edward's name, and finally, after searching for him for a few minutes, she lies down and throws a tantrum, because Edward has left her all alone for the other vampires to make her their target. And as she thought, the three vampires found her and attacked her. To defend herself, Becca uses pepper spray, but accidentally uses it on an innocent woman who had come to save her. With no one to help her, the three attack her, but Edward intervenes and eliminates Jack using a baseball bat. The two remaining vampires run away to save themselves. Becca struggles as the venom spreads. So, Edward sucks all the venom out of her with a straw, and once he's done, he leaves her. Becca couldn't get over him even as the months passed. Everything reminded her of Edward, and his overstyled, set with strong hairspray hair. Every night she would have nightmares that would make her scream really loud, screaming into a loudspeaker loud. Frank would rush into her room and would talk to her to calm her down. He knows breakups are hard, especially when one is dumped by as handsome and hunky as Edward compared to his daughter, whom he considers as not much of a looker, and she twitches a lot. He ends his prep talk with a suggestion to work on her style and overall looks, and wishes her good night. He also tells her that Jennifer called. Becca goes to the movies with Jennifer, and Jennifer states how lame it is to date a vampire. Becca agrees as they come out of the theater showing Twilight Saga, Breaking Dawn movie. Jennifer can't believe the characters in the movie get married and have a vampire baby. Many people who had been waiting in line for hours booed, as she just revealed the spoiler. They reach the parking, and Jennifer leaves Becca alone to fend for herself, as she will have to pass the scary-looking bikers to get to the truck. As she walks towards them, one of the big guys asks her to sit on his bike. She keeps walking and sees Edward telling her to walk away, as the guys are dangerous. She doesn't listen and keeps walking. The man who called her to sit on his bike throws his beer can on Becca's head. It is then Becca realizes how dangerous these guys are, and Edward reminds her that he told her so. Becca finds herself going to Jacob to spend her time. Jacob has pointed ears and a nose of a pooch, with furry hands and a tail, yet Becca cannot put her finger on what's different about him. Jacob explains he has become a man now. He manages to ask her if she is ready to date him, but every time he tries to say it, his voice gets drowned by the engine of the bike first, and then the honking of a passing truck. So he yells and finally pops the question. But Becca says she doesn't like to be yelled at, and excuses herself to take the bike on a spin. She cuts the brake line and takes off. Edward appears again, and asks Becca to stop, or she'll hurt herself. Edward, now running to keep up with Becca, asks her not to drink the milk, as she is lactose intolerant. But Becca is determined. She is willing to do anything to be with Edward. So she drinks the milk. Suddenly her stomach starts growling, and she loses control of her bike. She falls hard and starts bleeding from her forehead. Jacob rushes to her aid and gives his shirt to stop the bleeding, revealing his very furry chest. Jacob runs away to get help. A hand extends to help Becca up. She thinks it is Jacob, and takes it, only to find it is a member of the nomadic vampires. He finds her scrumptious, and starts adding Tabasco sauce to her hand. But Becca pushes him away and runs. He soon catches up to her, but Jacob comes to her rescue and, in the process, turns into a chihuahua. The vampire remains unfazed and says he cannot stop him as he is not a werewolf. Jacob says he knows that is why he travels in a pack. The others come out and snarl at the vampire. They are wearing nothing but really short denim shorts. Suddenly they start performing a dance routine on the song It Is Raining Men. Once done with their sultry dance, they attack the vampire and lay him to rest. Jacob turns back to his normal self, and Becca doesn't make an effort to hide that she is attracted to his perfectly toned abs and body, and even makes him sign a copy of a Teen Buffet magazine featuring him. He gladly signs it, and then lifts Becca in his arms to take her home. Meanwhile, Edward has moved to Rio. He sits on the couch with an extra large size of ice cream bucket and cries while watching movies. Iris comes to get him back because she had a vision about Becca. Edward says he has moved on from her and is now dating Lady Gaga. But Iris insists, saying Becca might be in trouble or even worse. This is enough reason for him to come back. Jacob brings Becca home and gives her some herbal tea. He takes off his shirt and she asks why he is doing that. Jacob says it is in his contract that he has to take off his shirt every 10 minutes of screen time. Before sitting down beside Becca, Jacob sprays himself with tons of cologne. He reminds Becca that Edward left her, but he will never do that. He wants to take things out of the friendship zone. Becca admits she feels safe and secure with Jacob, but with Edward, she cannot help herself but feel titillated. Jacob has had enough, and he gets up from her bed. The phone rings, and she asks him to get it. Edward is calling. He asks for Officer Crane, and says it is very important that he speaks with him. Jacob finds a note from Frank to Becca on the fridge, which says he has gone to Fisherman Scully's funeral. Jacob tells Edward that Frank is at the funeral. Edward is in shock. To add to Edward's horror, Jacob adds a horrific description of how the body had to be put together to look presentable for the funeral. Edward crushes the phone and says what Iris saw was true. He claims he cannot live without her and announces he is going to meet the same fate, and leaves while Iris is busy having another vision, where she sees Becca is fine. But it is too late, and Edward has left till she can tell him what she saw. Becca is sitting on her front porch and sees Jennifer, Rick, and Derek going to the prom. Jennifer teases Becca for not having a date to the prom, and shares her bottle of champagne, which lands on Becca's head. Soon Iris arrives in her luxury car, and asks Becca to get in the car. Iris explains that Edward doesn't want to live anymore because he thinks Becca is dead. Becca finds it absurd as to why Edward would think that. Iris pretends not to know either. She tells Becca that Edward is going to Zolteri to get himself finished. Becca thinks Edward is such a romantic. All of a sudden, Jacob jumps on the car bonnet and asks Becca who she wants to be with. He pleads with Becca to finally tell him. But as soon as she is going to tell him, he gets distracted by a cat and chases it, leaving the most debatable question unanswered. Becca goes back to the topic of Edward and asks Iris who are Zolteri. Iris explains that Zolteri is the Evilist, blood-sucking, narcissistic vampire coven. Edward is going to expose himself to sunlight and have Zolteri take matters into their hands, as they don't allow the humans to know that vampires live among them. Becca asks where this is going to happen. Iris tells her it is going to happen at the prom because of the Saint Salvador theme, and the Zolteri never misses a good Saint Salvador Day festival. They all flew all the way from Italy. At the prom, Jennifer and Rick rig the ballot box by adding thousands of pre-stamped ballot papers with their names, so they can win the most coveted prize of the prom king and queen. Iris and Becca reach the prom, and Iris tells Becca she is the only one who can save Edward. She has to show him that she is alive. Becca runs out of the car and runs to find Edward. Back to the present, Becca and the member of the Zolteri are in the middle of a jump, but the Zolteri misses Becca and lands on a hoarding, while Becca lands on Jennifer and Rick. She runs towards Edward, and luckily twilight occurs, followed by a new moon and eclipse. Edward calls out to everybody to look at him in his glory. Everybody laughs as Edward showcases a very saggy bottom. Becca runs into his arms, and Edward is overjoyed to find her alive. He squishes her face as he breathes a sigh of relief. Becca hands him his clothes and tells him they have to go, taking him to safety. Edward apologizes to Becca and promises he will never leave her again. The Zolteri is standing right behind them, and Darrow, the leader of the Zolteri, picks Edward by the neck and throws him on the music system. As they fight, the music keeps changing, and the crowd changes their dance moves to match the song. Frank and Bobby also come to the prom to check on Becca, but seeing her dance with the vampires, he thinks she is having fun with her friends. He starts to leave, but Bobby stops him, and Becca tells him that all the executions were done by the vampires, as she points to the ones making her dance with them. She continues that Edward is one of the vampires, and Bobby is a werewolf. Frank listens intently, but still doesn't understand a thing, and concludes Becca is talking about the theme of the party. He leaves, and Bobby shows his displeasure at Becca for disclosing their secret. Edward and Darrow fight till Edward sees Becca in the custody of the other members of the Zolteri. Darrow decides to leave Edward on one condition: Becca will have to become a vampire. Edward outrightly denies. Darrow asks his fellow vampires to take care of Edward as they do with the vampires they want to eliminate. Fearing such a tragic end, Edward agrees to do as asked and turn Becca into a vampire. An announcement by the principal draws everybody's attention. Rick and Jennifer are announced as the prom king and queen. Everybody cheers, but the principal gets some news and stops everybody from cheering. He has come to know that Rick and Jennifer have got 69,000 votes in a class of 300, rendering them disqualification. Amidst the boos from the crowd, Jennifer headbutts Rick for spoiling her childhood dream. The principal announces that he will nominate the new prom king and queen, and chooses Darrow and June because they aptly represent the theme of the prom. Darrow is beyond ecstatic. From the stage, after shedding some tears, he calls out to Edward to bite Becca. Edward is reluctant, but Becca insists he finishes the job. Edward says he'll turn her into a vampire on one condition. He asks her to marry him. Becca instantly says yes. Edward puts a huge diamond ring on her finger. Becca asks him to bite her and shows the guided marking on her neck. Edward bites her, and Darrow laughs an ominous laugh from the stage. After Edward is done, he asks Becca how she feels. Becca admits she feels perfect, exactly as she imagined. Suddenly, a Jacob fangirl strikes Edward on his head with a nail-clad baseball bat. Edward survives the impact, and a newborn vampire Becca attacks the fangirl.